writer and researcher who's currently working on a book on the theme of reproductive violence, so looking at, particularly in relation to new abortion rules in places like Texas. And then Egle Cesnulyte will be talking about her research and how that is informed by sex work positive feminism. And then Jennifer, so Egle Cesnulyte, I should say, is a lecturer at the University of Bristol. And then Jennifer Thomson, who's a senior lecturer at the University of Bath, will be presenting on her work on the co-optation of feminism, looking at scholars who are critical of neoliberalism, such as Fraser. So we'll start off with Sian. Each one will present for about 15 minutes. Please, if you've got any questions, any comments, can you use the chat? And then at the end of all three presentations, we'll have questions. So we'll draw some questions for the chat. It would be great if we have questions for the individual speakers, but also, I hope some people can formulate questions that might cut across the presentations as well, or comments. So, Sian, are you ready to go? Has Sian just frozen at the wrong moment?
Sorry, my internet dropped, so I've put it onto my mobile data, so hopefully that won't happen again.
Okay. Do you need a couple of minutes? Are you ready to go? Perhaps, could you say a little bit more about your work and then move into the presentation?
Yes, so thanks ever so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. Hopefully my internet doesn't go again, but maybe I'll stop my video for a little while until it sort of stabilizes. So as mentioned, I'm a journalist and writer working on issues around reproductive rights. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how socialist feminism has helped inform my research into the far right and their attacks on reproductive rights. And crucially, I'm going to talk about the far right attack in itself and how socialist feminism can help us understand what this attack looks like and how to defeat it. So before we start, I thought it's probably worth defining what socialist feminism is, which is easier said than done. Sheila Rowbotham says that in the UK, they came up with the term socialist feminism in the 60s and 70s to explore the intersection between class and gender, although in the US, the term radical feminism was being used to explore similar tensions at the same time. So I went onto Wikipedia, as everyone does when looking for definitions, and it says, socialist feminists consider how the sexism and gender division of labour of each historical era is determined by the economic system of the time. Those conditions are largely expressed through capitalist and patriarchal relations. So while much of socialist feminism is rooted in Marxist ideas about capitalism, so I'm going to try my video again. Marxist ideas about capitalism, work and property, it rejected the idea that once class was sorted out, gender equality would follow. Instead, socialist feminists argued that gender and class work together to create distinct forms of oppression and privilege for women and men of each class. So as I mentioned, my research is particularly looking at the attack on women's reproductive and sexual rights by the far right. And I'm interested in how socialist feminism creates a framework from where we can think about that attack, analyse it, and challenge it. But to do that, we first need to understand what that far right attack is. So at the moment, I would argue that reproductive rights are in crisis. Around the world, far-right authoritarian and patriarchal regimes are cracking down on women's freedoms, from the threat to Roe versus Wade in the US to the tightened abortion ban in Poland and the increasingly natalist policies in Hungary, Russia, Italy, and other countries. And while these threats are being enacted in courts and in parliaments, the plebeian far-right is obsessed with something that we call the Great Replacement conspiracy theory. And this is a baseless conspiracy that posits that the West or the global North is being overrun by people from the global South who are replacing the white majority. And they argue on the far right that this replacement is being aided by feminists who are deliberately repressing the birth rate through contraception and abortion. Now, it's important to understand that this is complete nonsense. There is no evidence for any of this, but this is what they believe on the far right. So they want to prevent this so-called replacement, it's also known as a white genocide, by pinning women to reproductive labour. And they want to position women as wombs of the nation and have white babies to make X country great or white again. And I really like this quote from the US abortion doctor, Willie Parker, who really summed it up in his memoir. And he said, "The thing all too many white anti-abortion activists really want, which they can't say out loud, is for white women to have more babies in order to push back against the browning of America." And it represents this program of nation building where race is nation, as described by feminist writers Ginzia Arutza, Tiffy Bhattacharya, and Nancy Fraser in their manifesto, Feminism for the 99%. And they wrote how incentivizing births of the right kind while discouraging those of the wrong kind, governments have designed education and family policies to produce not just people, but, for example, Germans, Italians, or Americans. So these attacks represent 3 pillars in fascist thought architecture that underpins the far right's aims and motivations. And the first and probably most important one for our understanding is the fascistic concept of the natural order. So according to the theorist Mark Neocleus, fascism is an anti-human movement, and it believes that humans are dictated by nature, and because nature is unchanging, any societal progress such as women's rights are contrary to that nature. This means that things like abortion rights are positioned as unnatural, or in the language of far-right conspiracy, as satanic. And this runs contrary to Marx's theory that says humans can change society, and in turn, humans can be changed by society. And in the fascistic natural order, men are placed as superior to women, white people are placed as superior to Black people, and LGBTIQ people just simply should not exist at all. So understanding the fascist concept of nature is really crucial in understanding where women are positioned in the far right. And because fascism believes nation and nature cannot be separated, the success of the nation becomes dependent on obeying these so-called natural laws about women's bodies and women's roles. And in the far right mind, that natural role is reproduction. And as such, women are positioned and pinned to reproductive labor in fascist movements. And so Neocleus says that by articulating nature as a standard by which a social order can be judged, the success of the nation becomes dependent on the natural laws of sexuality and gender. This provides fascism with the grounds for distinguishing the normal from the abnormal, where the abnormal is read as a threat to the natural and thus the national order. And there are 2 other pillars in fascist thought architecture. One is called the mythic past, and one is a constant state of war. But I'm going to skip over those so that we can get into the socialist feminism bit. So if we understand the attack on women's reproductive rights as coming from this fascist idea of nature and this desire to pin women to reproductive labour, what socialist feminism has helped me do in my research is to provide a framework to understand this attack and therefore to respond to it. And this is because socialist feminism gives us the tools to think about labour and reproductive labour in particular, and see how the right treat the women's bodies as resources to exploit. Now, what's interesting is the right to abortion smashes the fascistic notion of the natural order because it decouples women from this imposed biological destiny. It argues that women's oppression isn't natural and that women's role in society isn't solely reproductive, to use the kind of old feminist slogan, biology is not destiny. It states that gender oppression is an artificial structure created by men, and therefore men's self-claimed authority over women cannot be natural. But why did this oppression arise in the first place? And again, socialist feminism gives an answer to this, and it pins it to capitalism and the rise of capitalism. So according to the writers of Feminism for the 99%, capitalist societies are by definition wellsprings of gender oppression. Far from being accidental, sexism is hardwired into their very structure. And what's really interesting is the history of abortion, and the restrictions on abortion can really tell us something about this and how sexism is hardwired into capitalist structures. Because back before the dawn of capitalism, things like laws and attitudes around abortion were much more relaxed. And women who were pregnant and didn't want to be took herbs to, as they called it, bring down the flowers, which was a euphemism for inducing miscarriage. And in her seminal examination of feminism and capitalism, Caliban and the Witch, Silvia Federici explains how the Catholic Church took an indulgent view on abortion and contraception, prompted by the reason that women may wish to limit their births because of economic reasons. And this all started to change around the time of the rise of capitalism and around a sort of turning point in terms of a move away from metaphysical explanations of human existence and a kind of the rise of Protestantism. And this is because capitalism relies on the reproduction of labour in order to generate wealth for the capitalist class. That shift turned women's bodies into a public good to be exploited, and the idea that childbirth and the choice to have a baby was a private family matter started to evaporate. Women's bodies instead became public property. Under the new capitalist economic order, women's wombs were now put to work for reproducing labour, and the pinning of women to reproductive labour was a brutal capitalist takeover, an entrenchment of male supremacy into the economic and social system, and we're still living with the consequences of that today. Federici explains it as, at the very moment when an ideology was forming that stressed the centrality of labour in economic life, severe penalties were introduced in the legal codes of Europe to punish women for reproductive crimes. So capitalism started to change women's status in society to one of reproduction, and abortion became frowned upon because it meant depriving the system of a vital commodity, another worker body. By denying women control over their bodies, Federici said, the states deprived them of the most fundamental condition for physical and psychological integrity and degraded maternity to the status of forced labour. And we can see these kind of repeated patterns throughout history. Whenever there has been a crisis in capitalism, there has been a concurrent pushback against women's reproductive rights. So when we look at the kind of beginning of capitalism, and Europe had endured this demographic crisis through the Black Death, through the spread of the plague. And this kind of coincided with a rising distrust of women's and reproduction, where, you know, in sort of 14th century Europe, we had a lot of women who were working as surgeons and midwives, and they started slowly to be pushed out of these spaces, and men started to enter it. And when a similar demographic crash had happened in the 1600s, we started to see this intensity with the witch hunts. And this was really focused on midwives and women who had knowledge about herbs and reproduction. And again, we started to see this shift from women having control in the birthing room and in the birthing suite, from midwives being kind of trusted members of the community, to men becoming more and more involved in obstetrics. And there's some really interesting anecdotes around this time of men being seen as like the givers of life, because they sort of, you know, they took the baby, they caught the baby as it came out of the women, and they were sort of seen as bringing this baby into life. And it's also around this time that we started to see more of a focus on preserving the baby's life in exchange for the mother's life if there was like real issues or dangers during childbirth. So a really interesting example, which has a very kind of similar situation to where we are today, was in mid-19th century USA. And up until around the 1860s, abortion was largely legal in the States. But a couple of things were happening around that time, which created these pressure points, which led to this pushback on abortion rights. The first one was that women were gaining more independence and fighting for more of their freedom. So we had a burgeoning women's movement in the States around the 1860s. Around the same time, there was this real threat posed to the ruling class by the freeing of enslaved people from whom they'd exploited and extracted their wealth. And the second was an increase in immigration from countries such as Ireland, Mexico, China, and other non-so-called WASP communities. And these kind of combined forces, particularly the one around immigration, caused this growing anxiety that white male supremacy was under threat. And the historian Leslie Reagan describes it as anti-abortion activists pointed out that large immigrant families, many of them Catholic, were larger and would soon outpopulate native-born white Yankees and threaten their political power. And I just find this really interesting because it's so similar to the kind of rhetoric we see on far-right message boards today about the Great Replacement. And there's this incredible quote by this guy called Dr. Harold Storer, who really kind of moved in the abortion laws in America forward and was really sort of activating on these issues, who says, "Will the new regions of our land be filled by our own children or by those of aliens? This is a question our women must answer. Upon their loins depends the destiny of the nation." So again, we see these echoes around nation and race, and believing that women's wombs should be pinned to reproductive labour to recreate the nation and to protect the nation. And possibly more famously, in the 1920s and 30s, we had the fascist and Nazi regimes in Italy and Germany, and they both reacted to women's growing liberation and the collapse of capitalism by enforcing reproductive control. So that brings us up to now, where we're facing this new backlash against women's reproductive freedoms. And as before, this backlash has come at a time of perceived demographic crisis and a crisis in capitalism. So back in the 1960s, capitalism suffered what Janet Yellen called a reproductive shock with the introduction of the contraceptive pill and the legalization of abortion in most global North countries. And centuries of biologically rooted oppression were about to be overturned as women took control of their reproduction. Now, initially, capitalism responded to women's increased bodily autonomy by advancing reproductive rights, because they saw that if women had control of their fertility and women's bodies could no longer be an exploitable research for reproductive labour, they could take on a new role in capitalism as a consumer and as a worker. And it's not a coincidence that women's increased reproductive freedoms in the global north matched a boom period, particularly in the US. In some ways, we could think about it that we could get reproductive rights because the economy could afford it. But now, as we're facing a new crisis in terms of decreasing birth rates, the climate crisis, and an aging population, we're facing another backlash in reproductive rights, because the switch from putting women to productive labour over reproductive labour means that there is this sort of perceived lack of workers being generated in the far-right mind. So this has been explained by Jenny Brown, who says the production of children and who will pay for it is no longer a social question. It has become a key economic battlefront. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see, we're seeing more and more in the mainstream media and in the press and in political conversations about, women's responsibility to have children, the fact that there's this kind of demographic crisis, the birth rate collapsing, but no one's really asking questions about how to empower women to have the families they want to have, and also putting a lot of blame on women for not fulfilling their natural role, for replicating their natural order that is so key to the far-right mind. So to conclude, socialist feminism helps us to understand women's position within capitalist society. It recognises that women's oppression is rooted in a biological oppression that classes women's bodies an exploitable resource that can generate more worker bodies to enrich the ruling class. When we understand this, we can make sense of the far-right attacks on reproductive and sexual rights, which disrupt male supremacy and smash to pieces the fascistic notion that there is a natural order where women's bodies should be pinned to reproduction and men's bodies should be pinned to war. Thank you very much. I hope my internet didn't play around too badly.
We could hear you loud and clear all the way through. Thank you very much, Sian, and for that presentation in which you brought together and shown the work that the socialist feminism does for you as a theoretical perspective. Please, I can see that there's comments in the chat for people who've been engaging with this and can relate it to some of their own work. Please do. Comments and questions are all welcome, and we'll pick out some of them and invite you to present your question or your comment yourselves. Thank you, Sian. So next is Egle Cesnulyte as senior lecturer in policy and international development at the University of Bristol. Egle, I'm going to let you continue in terms of presenting and introducing what you'll be talking about today. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Angeline. Thank you for having me here. I was very excited when Jutta emailed me and asked me if I want to be on a panel that speaks about how different theories or particular theories inform my research. However, then she emailed me asking me to tell what kind of feminist I am so that can be used in advertising, and that sent me on an entire trip, because I have some of the troubles with putting myself in one particular camp. So just to give you a little bit more of the context, the work that I will be speaking about today, and telling you the story about how I'm using different theories, is my work that I started as a PhD student that resulted in my first book, shameless promotion. And in this research, I was interested in exploring the relationship between neoliberalism and especially neoliberal transformations, and what that means for the livelihoods of women, and in particular for women who are selling sex. And because I was sitting at this intersection of many different theoretical positions, it was always hard for me to identify the one particular perspective. So I could have as well said that I'm a socialist feminist, but Sian already took that label, so I thought, okay, I will not repeat myself. I could have also represented myself as radical feminist, but I saw that Jennifer said that she's doing that in the blurb. So I thought, okay, never mind, let's go with sex work positive label, because that is also something that I am doing. And actually, when I was preparing for this talk and I was thinking what kind of theories influenced my work, I found all the books that kind of represent my journey, and I have all of them here. And this will be the structure of my talk very briefly. So when thinking about theories that influenced me, I of course have to start with Cynthia Enloe. the book of bananas, beaches, and bases has been nicked by one of my PhD students, so I cannot show it, but this is another one which will work here. And this would be, you know, like very important theorizing that pushed me to start thinking and asking important questions and allowed me to formulate my research challenge, right? So like Cynthia Enlow's question of where are the women was the one that resonated with me, and especially in the field of international political economy, right? So like where are the women, and, you know, like the Cynthia's thinking about where gender is in the international relations, even when we don't see the gender, was something that led me to my research project and the initial conceptualization. Then, because I was coming at it through the international political economy angle, of course, you know, like the whole school of scholars on which I drew and who were important ones here, and here I have a book that was edited by Shirin Ray and Georgina Whalen and Ruth Pearson, would be all the women, all the feminist economists who are working in the area of international development, right? So like these would be the theorists that opened gender questions and asked the questions of where are the women, both in the international political economy, but in particular in the international political economy of development, right? So like these would be the fundamental perspectives that shaped my work in very important ways. However, none of them spoke about sex workers, right? So like after this initial conceptualization of a research question, then I already had my topic. I had to go and find someone who I can look up to and think like, okay, this is who I want to be when I grow up. And this is what kind of researcher I want to be. And, you know, like I was still looking at a lot of theoretical approaches that are critical of neoliberalism or that are critical of gendered issues in the development sector were not all the story for me. And like, so I kept reading until I came by the book by Louise White. And this is the first book that I read, and I thought, oh, wow, like this is who I want to be when I grow up. This is the kind of research that I want to do. Because Louise White, in this particular book, what she is doing, and when I read it the first time, I probably did not understand it, that that's what she is doing. But she is a Marxist historian who is exploring the experiences of women in colonial Nairobi. And women who were allowed to be in colonial Nairobi, who were non-European women, there are women who were selling sex in Nairobi. Right? Nairobi was one of those colonial segregated cities that discouraged African women of settling there. And the only women who ended up living there, not the only, but the majority of women who ended up living there were women who were very often engaged in sex work and who turned to be landlords very often, or who were accumulating a lot of capital. So even though at that point when I was reading this research, I did not, you know, necessarily clock that this is definitely something that is coming from Marxist perspective. This is someone who is asking very critical Marxist-inspired questions in a particular African context. This is definitely who shaped me as a scholar, right? So like and you know, like only later when I was rereading this book, when I was writing up my research, I realized that this was a very important direction in my work, because this work encouraged me to ask questions about how class can be gendered, how the livelihoods can be gendered, and how they are linked to the capitalist structures, or what does capitalism even look like in the context that are non-European and where we don't see industrialization in this classical Marxist sense, where we don't see the working class in this classical Marxist sense, and where things are very highly gendered because of the colonial segregation policies in a particular context like that of Kenya, for example. Right, so like thinking together with people who were coming from Marxist perspective and who were trying to transport Marxist lens to African context, and found that, you know, like the Marxist perspectives can be not sufficient to understand what is going on the ground in places like Kenya, for example, or the big African cities like Nairobi or Mombasa, where I ended up working, would be a very important part that formed my research. And it also encouraged me to see sex work or commercialized sex as something that has something to do with a particular social class that is also located within broader dynamics of making living or livelihoods, that allowed me to see how these livelihoods and the processes of accumulation of the capital can be highly gendered, how they might be building on gendered inequalities that exist in the society, and that might mean very different things in the places like Mombasa from the context that might be familiar to us in UK, for example. Right, so like all these troubles that Marxist scholars working in African context had with Marxist theory were definitely something that translated into my research, and that invited me to think about things in these very particular ways. Right, so like I especially remember this one passage from Lisa's White book where she was trying to speak to a woman with whom she had her interviews about some particular, like concepts. And she is writing in a book that this is how she learned the word crazy in Swahili, because the woman disagreed with her interpretation and they were saying like, you are just crazy. So this is how she was learning the language as well. And I was thinking, okay, so like that is really interesting. And, like this is also something that invited me to be very careful about what I'm doing and how I'm traveling to this particular context of Kenya with my Western ideas of things, right? Because all the things that I read up to now, Cynthia Enloe and all the UK feminists who are working in economics or in the development economics, and Louise White as well, right? So American historian, I was like, okay, so she is sending me a warning that I have to be a little bit more careful here. And that sent me to reading of something else entirely, and that is the whole literature on sex work. So I was looking for sex worker voices to see how they are speaking about realities that I'm studying, right? And this was the moment where I discovered that actually with my research, I am part of a war. So in famous, depending on how you approach this, sex works in the literature that focuses on sex work or prostitution, or, like depending which camp you're coming from, like that can be many different ways of labeling it. So after reading that much, after having, like this relationship with all these different theories, I found myself at war, and with all the different and clashing theoretical positions regarding people who are selling sex, right? So like then I went on all that exploration there, from all the way, like of radical feminisms to all the way to social feminisms. And I was trying to locate myself and my research there and to see how what I am studying is actually fitting with those realities. And this is where I found one theoretical position that I felt most comfortable with, and like that, depending on who you are reading, would be labeled either as social feminism or sex work positive feminism. And here I just want to show the book of Julia Connell Davidson, who was writing about the prostitution, power, and freedom when she was examining the cases of the Caribbean countries and sex tourism. And this allowed me to, find the theoretical perspective, which I was more comfortable with, and that gives space to people who are actually selling sex to have their own input. And that was very attentive to the local, particular social economic conditions and their importance in, in the way that women make different choices and how they might end up, choosing to sell sex because of all these different socioeconomic conditions and because of all the different local contexts that might influence them, right? So looking for this, different way of frame my research, I already went through that many theories, and I was still nowhere close to finding one that accurately describes me, right? So Louise White was still staying with me because she was the only one who was writing about Kenya, but she was writing about colonial Nairobi, so it was nothing to do with today and nothing to do with neoliberalism. And so that brought me to the last bunch of different kind of literatures, and this was my, attempts and diving with African scholars and people who are writing on the different issues to do with my research. And these would be, scholars like Silvia Tamale, who is a professor at University Makerere, or, by Christopher Baxquega, who is writing again, about Ugandan context. And the interesting thing about this particular literature that is coming from the African context, and that is thinking about sexualities and sex work from, from those communities, is that when they theorize those things, they are not engaging in sex work. They are not necessarily, speaking about it using the languages that the Western scholars are using. They would not necessarily label themselves as socialist or Marxist or political economist or something, but they are still speaking about similar issues, right? And so I found that to be, very interesting, because even though they would be using different terms, they were still speaking about the importance of making a living. They were still speaking about the importance of gender and gender inequalities. And they were blending the borders between what is academia and what is activism by actively engaging with one another, right? So like in Silvia Tamale's book, which is, this is the classical work. This is the first, reader of African sexualities that came out, and this was a big one. There were quite a few chapters that were directly relevant to my research and allowed me to think about my research in a very productive ways. But these would be chapters that were written, for example, by sex worker activists who are thinking about those things, thinking about livelihood, thinking about the power, thinking about the gender, thinking about the local economy in which they cannot make the money, and there the sex work gives them the power to make certain choices. Or, like Silvia Tamale herself, activism between legal activism and being an academic, and this fusion. So, I'm looking at my timer and I see that I have less than a minute. So I will try to bring all those books together. And what, I'm trying to say with this talk, is that I'm always very envious of people who can easily say, I'm this kind of feminist. Because my journey through the theories and the different engagement with different theoretical perspectives was not that straightforward. And I had to draw on all these different kinds of scholarship and theoretical positions to stay, to make sure that I do justice to the life histories of the women that I collected, to the conversations that I had with them, and that, to speak to the, sorry, that was my timer, to speak to the data in a proper way. Right, so this would be me. Multiple theories that speak to one another, often would be in conflict perhaps, or not in conversation all the time, but that informed my research from conception all the way through to realization. Yeah, thank you.
Egle, thank you very much. I think that was a fascinating presentation with a lot in there. We've got Ella Barkley has asked if you could send through the titles of the books you've shown, but I think that's something we can extend to all three of the speakers. If you would recommend, we're thinking about perhaps people who are just exploring the possibility of working with feminist perspectives within their own research, and if there are books or readers that you would particularly, or just papers that you would particularly recommend for kind of early career researchers in that position, then please do pass them on, and we'll make those titles, we'll share that. We can't make the titles available, but we can share the names of the titles through our website, through the SWDTP website. And to say the recordings will be made available as well afterwards. Brilliant, thank you. So Jennifer Thomson, Senior Lecturer at the University of Bath, I think this positioning yourself within a particular type of feminism was a challenge that you also encountered. perhaps you could share with us more about really what's inspired and helped with theorizing within your own research.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, and thanks for inviting me to be part of this panel. It's really nice to finish a Friday with a nice discussion of feminism, so it's really lovely to be here. I'm sharing my screen, so hopefully you can see a PowerPoint presentation up on your screen now too. Fantastic, thank you, Angeline. And yeah, this, like Angeline said, this is I think quite a struggle. Feminism is a very rich and diverse theoretical and empirical field, and it's difficult to I think know, even within you know, what is for me a relatively short research career, where I most sort of see myself fitting, I guess, in terms of my research, and where I think most of my interests are. So I've chosen to focus today on what I've called contemporary feminist critiques of feminism, which is a bit wordy, and I'm not sure it quite encaptures what these feminist theorists are doing, but I hope that will become a little bit more clear as I speak. But broadly speaking, I'm talking about a group of women largely who are working with the idea, or are proposing the idea that feminism has been co-opted essentially by neoliberal ideas and by neoliberal institutions. And that it has become, in Nancy Fraser's words, become a kind of handmaiden to late capitalism, and in doing so has lost its original impetus as a critical and resistant force in the social and political world. And this idea that feminism has been co-opted really comes out of American feminism in particular, and two key pieces of writing from feminist theorists Hester Eisenstein and Nancy Fraser. Fraser, who very much identifies with the socialist feminist tradition that Sian was speaking about earlier. And Hester Eisenstein thinks about feminism in the US context, and she argues that feminism has become really somewhat, or really incredibly diluted and narrow in the focus that it's had to come in, that it has developed in contemporary American society. And it's come to mean individualism and the right to participate in the market economy as a worker and entrepreneur. So every other sort of social or progressive political impetus has been stripped back from feminism, and its main clear focus in contemporary discourse and politics is that right to act as an individual and to gain paid employment as an individual. So any other broader understandings, sort of social justice elements of feminism, have been stripped back. And Nancy Fraser, in an oft-cited article that forms part of her one of her books, kind of goes a little bit further than this and argues that actually second wave feminism is perhaps not responsible, but almost against its own understanding, has, as she puts it here, unwittingly become part of the success story of neoliberalism. Okay, that it's provided, as she puts it, a key ingredient of the new spirit of neoliberalism. So those ideas that second wave feminism were propagating about the right to take part in the workplace, about women's right in the workplace, have kind of unfortunately, against their own will, taken on this life of their own and become part of the broader argument for neoliberal reasoning and neoliberal capital. And these thinkers and these ideas have received all sorts of criticisms from within feminist theory and further afield. I think we can say with Eisenstein and Fraser in particular, we're getting a very rose-tinted view of second wave feminism here. Okay, second wave feminism is almost completely associated with socialist feminism. There's no sense of any other diversity or any other schools of thought within feminism in that period. And there's a real blindness, particularly in relation to questions of power and power structures within feminist thinking and feminism as a social movement, particularly in relation to questions of race and ethnicity. So all sorts of things that we can pick up in Eisenstein and Fraser for, but this has still become quite a dominant and quite a critical argument in contemporary feminist theory, and has gone on to inspire a lot more work, including the work of Catherine Rothenberg, who now teaches at the University of Nottingham, and her book, The Rise of Neoliberal feminism. And she kind of takes this argument a little bit further to ask, well, why? Why does neoliberalism need feminism? Why would neoliberalism want to engage with a movement that has, you know, strong roots in social justice and strong ideas about collective action, collective pressure, etc., etc.? And she argues that the neoliberal feminist subject has actually become very distinct from anything we might associate with more second wave understandings of feminism. She argues that this contemporary neoliberal feminist subject, as she puts it, disavows social, cultural and economic forces and accepts instead full responsibility for her own well-being and self-care. The neoliberal feminist subject is thus mobilized to convert continued gender inequality from a structural problem into an individual affair. So no longer does feminism require things of the state, no longer does feminism require things of social justice and broader understandings of justice. Instead, the answers just lie within. If you're a feminist, you've got the answers. You don't need help from your workplace, you don't need help from your family, from the state more broadly. Neoliberal understandings have stripped feminism of anything more collective. So this, like I say, has been hugely influential. But at the same time, theoretically, I think more broadly, it's led us into a little bit of an impasse. As Catherine Eschle and Beecher Magwashka put it in a later publication, we're kind of in a position now in a lot of feminist theory of this idea of a sort of good girls, bad girls dichotomy. Okay, so lots of feminist theorists argue that actually, no, this is wrong. Feminism is still resistant and critical and a fantastic force in the world today. And another group of feminist theorists argue, actually, no, feminism has been co-opted and it's awful and it's been stripped of any real political or social potential. And so we just end up in this sort of either or conundrum, bad girls, good girls dichotomy, as they put it. And so I think instead what we need to do is to kind of take this argument or take these ideas and push them in a little bit more of an empirical direction. And so I really like the work of Elizabeth Prugel, who's a Swiss feminist political scientist here, saying that what we really need to do is think about select feminist movement ideas. Okay, we need to get beyond this kind of broad brushstroke thinking about feminism writ large and think instead about more specific examples of feminism in practice, and think about the ways those are being integrated into neoliberal rationales and logics, what's being lost in the process, and what's perhaps being gained. So that kind of framework for action is something that I've been using in recent work that I'm doing on feminist foreign policy. Some of you might be aware of the concept of feminist foreign policy. It's gotten quite a lot of traction and interest in academic and media circles in recent years. Some of you might not. Feminist foreign policy is now followed by these 7 countries on the slide: Sweden, Canada, France, Mexico, Libya, Spain, and Germany. It was initiated by Sweden back in 2014 and most recently by Germany towards the end of last year following the creation of the coalition government. And there's no clear accepted definition of what these countries mean by feminist foreign policy, okay? They haven't got together and decided what feminist foreign policy means. They've all decided separately, and they have quite different understandings of that if you look at the different policy documents that they've written. They're also at very different stages of this journey. So Sweden has been doing this, like I said, since 2014. It's produced a series of policy documents in relation to how it understands feminist foreign policy. Whereas Germany, like I said, has only very recently started using this language and hasn't really produced anything practical or policy orientated so far. So I think in some sense, we can see quite clearly why feminist foreign policy might be accused of being an example of the co-optation of feminist discourse and feminist ideas. And many of these states are obviously strongly condemned for being quite hypocritical in their usage of feminist language, particularly in relation to foreign policy, when oftentimes domestically we're seeing a very different context. So we might think here about the very high rates of femicide and domestic violence, particularly amongst native populations in Canada. We might think equally about the very high levels of violence against women and femicide in Mexico. We might also think about the role that Sweden has had historically in the global arms trade in terms of being a producer of global arms and the role that it continues to have today. So to what extent can these states claim to be feminist actors in the international sphere when they have all sorts of problems related to gender inequality and militarism in their own domestic context. And that's not to neglect, of course, the fact that many of these countries, particularly the European countries, are also seeing strong populist right-wing political resurgences, which are often deeply racist, anti-immigrant and homophobic. So can these countries proclaim feminist language with one hand while something very different is happening in the other? But I think it's also too easy to just kind of stop there and say, okay, this is another example of the co-optation of feminist ideas. I think, again, we have to kind of use that framework from Bruegel and say, okay, well, what's happening here? Why do states need feminism? Why do they want to use this language? What are they gaining from it? And like I said, this is a fairly new research project, so I don't think I have all the answers to that so far, but I think it's very much tied to the kind of symbolic power that feminism has on the world stage in particular. I think feminism being employed by these states and by these actors essentially makes them look good. It makes them look like good liberal actors on the world stage. It acts as a nice symbol of the liberalness of these countries and their adherence to modernity and to the international liberal order. And so Trudeau here, again, Canadian Prime Minister, said on the night that he was elected, he's not talking specifically about feminism, but he is talking more broadly about his liberal agenda, in contrast to the previous Conservative government, saying, we're back, Canada is back, I'm part of that. And his feminist discourse and language within his cabinet and within his feminist foreign policy more broadly is clearly a part of that. It's about signalling Canada's intent and Canada's kind of brand on the world stage. So I think, again, it's about sort of taking this feminist theory and these ideas as a kind of toolkit and asking, well, to what ends? To what ends and for what means is feminism being co-opted and used in this way? And I think that's particularly interesting to think about right now in the context where we're seeing feminism used and employed by like a real diversity of actors in some way. And at the same time, as Sian was particularly speaking about in relation to the rise of populist radical right parties, we're also seeing at the same time a discourse moving very much in the other direction in terms of understandings of gender inequality and feminism. So I think a really interesting time to be doing doctoral research in this area and a really interesting time to be asking questions about gender. And I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, and thank you for making that link back. There's so many connections between Sian's presentation and your own, coming back to those themes of neoliberalism and the role, the way. Yes, you're talking about co-optation of feminism by neoliberalism, but also the way that within feminisms that there has been resistance and a calling out of neoliberalism, that there's both things going on. Do carry on as we kind of process this. Do carry on putting your comments and questions in the chat. I see that we have some questions, particularly for Sian in the chat. I was interested also, kind of looking across those presentations, Egle, that you're drawing on literature that was writing about sex workers during the colonial period and the colonial period in East Africa, and whether you kind of see, because we had of course a previous seminar on decolonizing social research, and whether you see those connections between neoliberalism as continuing some of those oppressions of colonialism, what's sometimes called neo-imperialism, and whether that was something that came up in your research.
Thank you, Angeline. This is an excellent question. And when thinking about the ways that insights from studying colonial period can be useful when thinking about contemporary neoliberal period, of course there are multiple legacies, right? Because even though quite a few things changed, the way that people make livelihoods and the way that those agendas might not have had that many changes even today, right? So like, thinking about my own research and looking at the life stories of women who were selling sex when I was collecting data, it is still very similar dynamics like during the colonial time. Many of them end up in Mombasa and start selling sex after the harvest fails and the families can no longer sustain them. And this is the exact same process like during colonial period. There, women who ended up in the colonial Nairobi would be women who were sent by their families from rural areas to make sure that they have some income because of the multiple failed harvests, for example, or the disease or the locust infections and all that. And today's neoliberalism that is eroding those, like security systems or the state structures that would allow to prevent that is still part of the same story of women ending up in the situations where they're either abandoned or have to find different ways of making the livelihood and sex work or selling sex. And I also make this conscious, difference between sex work and selling sex because, of course, my research informants, or many of them rejected the idea that they're sex workers. They said, we don't work, we sell sex. Or, they would say, I don't work, I do commercial sex work. Right, so they would have difficulties with a lot of those concepts that are coming from the West, and they would be speaking about this as part of a daily struggle to make a living. Right, that would be exactly the same conversation, a very similar conversation to the conversations that Louise White would be having in the 80s with women who were selling sex in colonial Nairobi. Right, so continuities are still there. We speak about different structures, so neoliberal structures, but neoliberalism, the way I see it, still builds on the inequalities that were out there, and the inequalities that are linked to colonialism or colonial economies are still there with us today, and gender is always part of that same story.
Thank you. Megan Johnson, you had a question in the chat for Sian. Do you want to turn on your, are you happy to turn on your microphone, or would you like to pose that question?
Hi, can you hear me? Is that okay?
Yes, very clearly. Thank you.
Oh, hi, thanks to everyone for those press presentations. I really enjoyed them. So I suppose my question for Sian was sort of briefly answered, as I think I sort of jumped in quite prematurely, but I suppose my question is, in terms of non-white immigration, it clearly presented a threat to not just white patriarchy, but also racial hierarchy. And that was something that you clearly addressed, in sort of terms of the aftermath of the Second World War. But I suppose my question is, how did you choose socialist feminist legal theory rather than intersectional feminist legal theory if you are considering, for example, concepts of miscegenation and caste contamination and the concept of whiteness more generally? How did you center and decide that you preferred socialist feminist legal theory rather than intersectionality?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, I sort of share Egle's reservations about labels, really. In lots of ways, my book is a book of investigative journalism rather than specific theory. So I think absolutely, when you're looking at issues around the far right and anti-immigration narratives and how those work to around abortion rights, you have to be looking through an intersectional lens, because we have to understand, for example, I write that my book is about bans on abortion and attempts to ban abortion, when we know that when abortion bans come in, it's more likely to be Black and minority ethnic women who are going to be worse effective, but both in terms of global North countries and also within the global South. So there's some really devastating data from 1960s New York, where the rates of deaths in terms as a result of unsafe abortion is double in Black and Puerto Rican communities and Puerto Rican women than it is with white women. So we absolutely need to be looking at this through an intersectional lens. And the other aspect of it is in terms of sterilization. So the far right is very preoccupied in the sort of very dark, very neo-Nazi corners of the internet, with issues of sterilisation, against Black and minority ethnic women. And again, we do have this incredibly ugly history in countries as diverse as Peru and America and Slovakia, and in China as well, I think, of sterilisation and programs that sought to sterilise Native women and also Black and minority ethnic women. So unless we're using intersectional framings, we're really failing to deal with the impact of abortion bans and the impact of the rise of the far right and its attitudes towards gender. I think what I found interesting is, in terms of looking at it through socialist feminism, was trying to understand the power dynamics around capitalism. And when we look at the far right, the far right's enemy is Marxism. It's this kind of horror of the left. There's some really surreal documents coming from radical right and religious right and far right organizations of this, where they talk about how feminism is communism and it's trying to destroy the family and all of this kind of stuff. So I think in terms of looking at how power and money works on the right, then the socialist angle is really helpful, but that's not to exclude an intersectional angle, because, as I say, the racialized aspect of abortion bans and the impact that it has on Black and minority ethnic or Black and global majority people is absolutely fundamental to any questions we need to ask.
Thanks, Sian. Yeah, that's answered my question. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you, Sian. We also had another question for Sian, or a comment really. No, it was a question from Joanne Norris. Joanne, would you like to pose your question?
Yes. No relation.
So I was thinking about it in terms of what you were saying about how initially capitalism had advanced women's rights in terms of contraception and things like that, because it meant that they could join the labour market, and then kind of took that away once it became too scary. And it made me think whether you've seen any indication that perhaps that means that the traditional family model will change slightly to move away from, I know there's a term for it, but I've forgotten the name of the classic family structure. But yeah, just if you think that we might see a change in the future and what that might look like.
Yeah, so first of all, I don't think capitalism gave women reproductive rights. It adapted to meet that change. So when they had this reproductive shock, there was kind of this two ways that you can go really, and capitalism kind of it goes back to what Jennifer was saying about co-opting sort of ideas about feminism to create the neoliberal self and the individual who's just striding out to work and is very flexible and can it was a response to the change in women's reproductive rights rather than the cause of it. But in terms of family, yeah, I think socialist feminism has a lot to say about the structures of the family, in part because on the far right, it's the patriarchal authority is an absolute central aspect of far right and fascist thinking. And this idea that every home should have the patriarchal authority figure in the father, who is the kind of shadow of the patriarchal authority figure as the leader of the state. And so, that's part of the reason why far right movements and populist authoritarian governments are so virulently homophobic. And we've seen in the last few years the absolute crackdown on rainbow families in countries like Hungary and Poland, which have enacted bans against gay adoption, among other things. So I think, socialist feminism has a real chance to disrupt these ideas of nuclear family and to think more about communal methods of raising children and communal ideas about family. And when you look back into kind of the 1970s socialist feminist groups, there was a real kind of force in this. Sheila Robe often writes a lot about kind of communal living, but also just kind of shared care and support for women who are having children and families having children. So yeah, I think capitalism and the far right is very, very dependent on the nuclear family and this idea that you have man, woman, 2.5 children, and it all links back to this idea of natural orders and who has authority, who is subordinate, who has control. And yeah, we can kind of use socialist feminism to sort of go, well, let's change this, let's disrupt this, and ask why it's so important for the far right to have this patriarchal model and what it's reflecting in terms of how it sees leadership and state working.
Thank you, that's really interesting. Nuclear family is what I was trying to think of. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanne. And Tom Cantelo, I think you had a question for Jennifer. Do you want to come in and present your question, or would you prefer one of us to? Is Tom Cantelo?
He's posted in the chat saying, would you kindly ask for me?
Okay, thank you. So Tom Cantelo says, hi Jennifer, really interesting talk. Thanks so much. I'm just wondering, given neoliberalism has previously co-opted elements of feminism, does resistive feminism have to be inherently collectivist, given that neoliberal stroke individualistic hegemony? So in which case, what makes this collectivism distinctly feminist?
I think that's a really great question. When I first saw your question, I wondered if when I was talking, I'd kind of made too much about the distinction between individual and collectivism being a key sort of feature here. But the more I think about it, the more it is. I think that's a key component of particularly that Rothenberg quote that I was using in Rothenberg's work, this idea that co-opted neoliberal feminism, whatever we want to call it, really focuses on the idea of individual women having solutions to problems and sort of the kind of girl boss approach to feminism, I guess, if you like. So yeah, I think a resistive feminism or resistant feminism has to be inherently collectivist. I think it has to look beyond individual solutions and see structural problems and structural solutions. I think some of the kind of classic counterexamples that are thrown up to to critique the arguments of people like Fraser and Eisenstein are very much examples of collective feminist action, right? So we might think about the incredible social movement activism and gains made often in relation to reproductive rights in South America, for example. So in Argentina, the neo-Menos movement, Me Too across the world, those are very much social movements, collectivist social movements that don't necessarily have even really kind of key leaders or key figureheads within them. They're very much about groups of women acting in concert rather than even individual women sort of coming to the fore. So yes, I think a kind of an idea of a resistant feminism, yes, has to have a collective approach. Although the second part of your question, what makes this collectivism distinctly feminist, is intriguing as well. I think it has to be collective action, which is simply centering women and discussion of women and women's rights. But yes, I think that's a very good point, that we need to have a kind of collective understanding of to be a resistant feminism. Yes.
Please do, everyone, feel free to carry on using the chat if you want to respond to the responses to any of the comments. Or as the conversation kind of moves along and may move in a different direction. There's more comments on your presentation, Jennifer, which I think you've seen. So Donna says, this debate is so fascinating. It matters which brand of feminism states adopt in terms of the obligations placed on the state to address/acknowledge inequality. I think it's also picking up on your point about the contradiction about how states project themselves, as conforming to a feminist agenda, whilst internally often not being so consistent in their policies. And Donna Crow-Urbaniak, apologies, Donna, if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly. Of course, within a capitalism, the value of an individual is determined by their capacity as capital enhancing agents. Thus, women's unpaid stroke invisible labour is devalued. Let's swing back to, I think, to some of the conversations we were having with Sian earlier. Jutta, you have a comment at the end. Do you want to speak to that?
I was just thinking in response to the end of Jennifer's comment about feminism being about women, and I think feminism is about women and women's rights and so on politically, but I think analytically, if we want to think about women and women's rights, and what we have to look at men and masculinities as well. And we just haven't really mentioned any of that Do you see that? Like we've mentioned intersectionality and capitalism and class and race and so on, but we've never mentioned men or masculinity. So it just struck me that that was, you know, it's just a really, really important element that should be added into the mix, I think. And obviously tons of feminists have done exactly that. So.
Yeah, no, thank you, Jutta, for that important point. I guess there was one question that I had, and I kind of mainly in connection to Sian's presentation, but I think it's something that anyone may wish to respond to, and you know, using the chat or our presenters, and that is, okay, how I think for some of the younger people that I'm working with, who feel very strongly with respect to the restriction on women's rights to abortion that you're seeing in different places across the world, but particularly in parts of the States, and you know, and some of the activism that's coming from the far right with respect to this agenda, including very locally. And I think one of the challenges is how, as people who identify themselves as feminist activists, who feel strongly, how do they respond to this in a way that makes that agenda and you know, that way of reasoning, which you've kind of, I really respect the way you've been into that, because it's not a pretty place. How do we make, in effect, how do we make that smaller? How do we belittle that mentality? What's a sensible way, you know, going forward to respond to that, particularly as it's now hitting the kind of mainstream agenda? It's making a huge difference to women's lives all over the world. You know, I also work in East Africa, and I'm aware of how women's access funding that was supporting women's access to not just abortion, but to any kind of birth control at all, has been cut severely, with massive implications for women and the choices they can make about their bodies. And I wonder, well, what is the appropriate way now, given where we are now, to respond? I mean, obviously one way is the way that you have done, Sian, with the research that you've been doing.
Yeah, I mean, the cuts to international aid is just, it's so devastating, and it's so enraging. And I like the head of MSI Reproductive Choices says that the cuts coming from the UK government could be worse than the global gag rule under Trump, which is, you know, it's just shameful. Like, we should be ashamed of that. And I mean, I know there's cuts across the board, so there's cuts to WASH sort of service funding, and cuts to all sorts of different kinds of aid, but like particularly it just sort of flew under the radar, the cuts to reproductive health. Anyway, I mean, I wrote an article about it. You can read it. But I think, to me, there's like, first of all, in terms of resistance and in terms of being able to tackle it, I mean, number one is like knowing that the threat exists. And I think for a long time, and I'm guilty of this as well, of just being like, you know, Roe happened, we've got the 1967 Abortion Act happened, maybe it's not so great over there, but it's okay, and things are all moving in the right direction, and it's always going forward. And of course that has been proven not to be the case. So it's being aware that there is a threat. And currently the UK government, or the UK government is, well, it closed a consultation last year about access to telemedicine for abortion. So in March 2020, to try and relieve pressure on the NHS at the start of the pandemic, they changed the rules on accessing early medical abortion so that women could get the pills from their doctor via a phone appointment, and take the abortion pills at home. Now that's going to come to an end on the 30th of March unless the government chooses to extend it. So, you know, this is something that we could be seeing a rollback on a very sort of what seemed like a potentially permanent change, and could become a temporary change, and we could be seeing this rollback on access to abortion in Britain in the coming months, which is concerning, because again, we think it's always going to go in one direction. That just applies to Britain because the laws in Northern Ireland are different after the change in 2020. I think it was March 2020 they changed the law in Northern Ireland. But the thing that I think is that everybody can do, which is very, very simple, is just thinking about language. So I've kind of ditched the term pro-choice. I don't think it's a very helpful term. I've moved to pro-abortion, because I think if we start talking about abortion as healthcare, and recognizing that it is a form of healthcare for women and girls, or for any person who is pregnant, then we can, we're sort of demystifying and taking away those kind of euphemistic language that says, oh, we can't talk about abortion, we can't name it, we're talking about choice. And again, I think this sort of choice language fits into what Jennifer was saying about, neoliberalism, and how it's kind of always about the individual choice. And thinking about abortion in terms of healthcare is a really positive, easy step that we can take to kind of tackle those silencing narratives. And, I think there's really positive moves coming from various Labour MPs to try and decriminalise abortion in Britain. So it's decriminalised in Northern Ireland now, but not in the rest of Britain. And it's still subject to these quite outdated laws, which were very progressive when they came in 1967. It's just 1967 was a long time ago, and things have moved on. So again, supporting those kind of moves to decriminalise abortion, it helps to take away that stigma, to take away this idea of it as being a moral issue or a legal issue rather than a healthcare issue, and really just banging on about it being about healthcare and women's health, and not about who gets to decide what happens to a woman's body. But if I had the answer, we'd be a bit, hopefully, more further on than where we are now.
That's a good start. Thank you, Sian. We've had more comments and questions come in. We've got a question from, sorry, I need to put this is why I'm having problems with the names. I can't actually read them. A question from Elif Nerduman-Kogan for Egle. Elif, do you want to ask that question, or shall I go ahead? Okay. Elif is saying, lost it, that she found your explanation, Egle, on women's description of sex brackets work as selling rather than working very interesting. What could be the salient reasons for the woman describing it not as work? We were just talking about how important it is to pay attention to language. So I think there's a...
Thank you. This is a very good question. And this is one of those areas that it took me a while to figure out what I'm doing in my research. And I'm using selling sex just to be faithful to the words of my interlocutors, who many of them argued with me over the concepts that I'm using, over my ways of understanding things. And I think at the core of all that is that Western theories that they're developed in response to the Western specific events and contexts do not travel that well at all. So, like when thinking about sex work movement that was developed in the European context, where most of, people have access to formal occupation, have access to formal job, does not mean the same thing in African context, where majority of population never have the formal jobs, majority of population are working in the informal economy. And for majority of women, it means that they are most of their time in the social reproductive work only, and they do not work necessarily, like in the same ways that us in Western contexts do, right? So like when, I would be asking about work, most of my informants would be saying, but that is a problem, we cannot get work. Or, like I would be saying, like, so what you are doing is work, and say like, no, what I'm doing is sex work, and that is struggling, right? So like the problem here is that these concepts that we understand in particular way, when taken in this different context of East Africa, their unemployment is a norm, their informal work is a norm. For many women, work in the family or on their farm is the norm. And where this, like formal work that is a norm for us is such an exception, for them, these words mean something different. When I ask them about work, they think about a work in an office or a work in the shop where you have some kind of, like things, and they know very well that they have very little chance of getting one of those. So what they see themselves doing as is they don't see themselves as working, because work is that one in the office, the conditioner, there you get a regular salary, there you are in some kind of structure. What they see themselves is struggling. And I think that when thinking about the woman that I am writing about, they are more comfortable with the idea of livelihood making, for example, right? And that is very different wording. Like, I'm sure that sex workers here would also agree with them that, like what they are doing is livelihood. Like, I'm in conversations with Bristol sex workers at the moment who are fighting the closure of the strip bars. And they're speaking exactly about the same thing, that this is the livelihood making, that this is the closing of the livelihood, of the particular livelihood that responds to their social reproductive roles or needs. And so, like, for me, I think that when we are thinking about feminist theories, we have to be very specific about the context that we are speaking about, because something that works to explain, say, like the rise of the far right in neoliberalism in UK or in the US does not travel almost at all. And a lot of feminist theories, like, for example, most of my informants, they would not agree with me that, like, what we are speaking about is a feminist issue. We would say, like, no, men also don't get jobs. And actually, it is not a problem, like, to be a woman, because for me, it is a bit easier because I can do sex work and I will make money. But for my boyfriend, it's much harder because he cannot do this job, right? So, like, there is a lot of pushing back and a lot of muddling of these categories that we think are self-evident. So for me here, it is like invitation to think about the local context, trying to understand the local context and to think, like, how do our Western often concepts travel to these different realities and think, do they still work? So when it comes to work, that's why it doesn't work in that context. And that's why I'm a little bit more comfortable with thinking about selling sex, because that is less tied to this concept and a little bit more attentive, I hope, to the opinions and a pushback of my own informants who were disagreeing with me that what they're doing is work. Right? Like, I even have one quote that I used for one of my article titles: I do not work, I do commercial sex work. She didn't like this label at all, and she was saying that, no, you're just crazy, I'm not working, that's the problem. Right? So, like, that would be like the answer, I think. But thank you, very good question, Elif.
Fascinating. Thank you so much. I got this this kind of result from my pilot fieldwork too, that the Syrian refugee women in Turkey do not see domestic work as a real work. And some of them just said they are doing it just for appreciation because they are getting a charity from somewhere or and dignity, pride, some other feelings also at play while seeing work as a real work. So yeah, I will read certainly your book and your articles to get more inspiration. Thank you so much, Egle.
Thank you, Elif. We're coming towards the end, and I think we have a fantastic question from Kaz Sutherland here. A fantastic question, actually, to end on that all of our panelists might want to respond to. So there, it's inspired by Jennifer's presentation. I think it's relevant to all of us. And she says, in homage to Paul's idea of looking at specific feminist movements rather than grouping all feminists together, do any of the speakers feel that there are perhaps non-Western, in brackets, feminist movements around the world from which Western feminists might take inspiration? If so, which characteristics might we adopt from other movements to strengthen our own? I mean, Egle, you did talk a little bit about this in a way. Do you want to start off in responding to that question?
Thank you, very good question. So, like, for me, I think I'm here very much with Chandra Mohanty and her classic article where she was saying that if we want to understand something, we have to start from the, place in the global south and with a poor woman, because this allows us to see the multiple oppressions at work that we might not see if we look at different contexts. So when I'm thinking about the global feminist movement, I want to see centering of these women who have more different intersecting oppressions. So, like, that would be women who are in the global south, who are self-organizing and want to be part of the global, like, movement. I'm not saying, necessarily sex workers are poorly, well, very difficult group to organize, and they might not necessarily be the best example, but I'm thinking, for example, about the waste pickers in India, women waste pickers in India and their organizational strategies. And I'm thinking that if we center the experiences of women who are marginalized on that many counts, you know, like not only because of their location, but because of their racialization, because of their caste, of their ethnicity and different things, I think that can teach us much more than centering the usual suspects who currently have a lot of space to voice their opinions. So that would be my answer.
Thank you, Egle. Jennifer or Sian, would either of you like to say something there?
Sure. I mean, I think the first thing that comes to mind is just to reference something that I spoke about earlier, and is kind of the feminist activism in Latin America and across Latin America, again, particularly around reproductive rights, and particularly in Chile and the Chilean context right now. I think Chile is just quite, well, following the successful, I guess, presidential election results, Chile is quite an inspiring place more generally in terms of the impact that social movements and protests have had and are continuing to have on shaping a new constitution in Chile and new politics in Chile. And a lot of that, the roots are really in feminist activism, okay? So all of the social protests that broke up or that broke out around Chile over the last couple of years, those really had their roots in feminists and in student feminist activism taking place in university campuses and more broadly across Chile as a whole country. So I think I find that context like incredibly inspiring and hopeful, and I think if we wanted to sort of think about things that we might want to see adopted elsewhere, I think it's about perhaps about working within institutional contexts to get started, perhaps. So like the way that the feminist movement really began there in the context of the university sector and then spread out. I think there is perhaps, again, some inspiration and positivity to be taken there in terms of thinking about feminism as a movement within higher education in this country too.
Yeah, I just echo both of those points, and as Egle says, thinking about kind of women's rights within workers' movements, like garment workers in Bangladesh and agricultural workers in the global south. You know, there's a huge amount of energy and activism that's happening, and huge opportunities for cross-border solidarity as well. And I think, I can't remember which strike it was that was happening in the UK, but there was some Bangladesh garment workers went on a fellow strike in Bangladesh, and it was kind of like, yes, you know, we might be in different parts of the world, but we're still fighting for the same fundamental rights as women in work, and we can have that cross-border solidarity. And, you know, to get out of those traps of thinking it's only ever one way, you know, there's so much opportunity for partnership and collaboration and listening to one another's movements and working together.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I think at this point, we say thank you to all of our speakers, to Sian, to Egle, to Jennifer. So whatever is your preferred way of showing your appreciation on Zoom, I invite you to do that, whether you like to raise your hands and give a shake or use the little icons to clap. So huge appreciation, and thank you very much for kind of giving generously of your time, including the preparation time for this. Thanks also to my co-conveners, to Fran and to Jutta, and also to the Molly and Eloise from the SWDTP, who've been kind of, well, organising things in the background. Thank you to everyone for your questions, for sharing a little bit about your research. That's really interesting to read about the different research that's going on across the SWDTP. So thank you for that. And as I said, that last question, I think, leads quite nicely into the next session, where we'll be focusing on intersectionalities. So do look out for more news of that. Thank you. And